I bought the land for the quiet, for the distance, for the kind of peace you can only get when your nearest neighbor is far enough away that their opinions can't reach you without effort. It wasn't a mansion lot in some cookie-cutter subdivision with identical mailboxes and a newsletter nobody reads. It was a patch of earth with real boundaries, old survey pins, and a deed that had my name on it in ink that mattered. The place had a gravel drive that crunched under tires like it was announcing your arrival to the trees. It had a sagging wire fence, a few stubborn oaks, and a small clearing where I parked my trailer while I worked weekends, slowly shaping the property into something livable. I wasn't breaking any laws, I wasn't running a junkyard, I wasn't hosting loud parties. I was just a guy with land, a plan, and the patience to build it right. The first sign that patience was about to be tested arrived on a Tuesday morning, stapled to my gate like somebody wanted to make a point. It wasn't even placed neatly. Whoever did it had used too many staples, as if aggression could be measured in metal. The paper was bright white, the kind of white that screams it came straight from a printer 5 minutes ago, and the text was bolded in places that felt theatrical. It announced in officious language that I was in violation of community standards and subject to enforcement actions, fines, and removal. It claimed the property fell within the jurisdiction of an HOA I'd never joined, never paid, and never heard of when I bought the place. It cited rules about structures, temporary living arrangements, and unauthorized improvements, like my trailer was a crime scene. It ended with a deadline, and the deadline was laughable, like whoever wrote it assumed landowners moved at the speed of their outrage. I stood there with the notice in my hand, looking past the gate and into my own property like I needed to confirm it was still real. The gravel drive was still there. The clearing was still there. The trailer was still mine. The trees didn't care about anyone's community standards. My first instinct was the normal one. Somebody made a mistake. Maybe they had the wrong parcel. Maybe there was a nearby subdivision and their board member had wandered too far with a clipboard and a mission. I'd heard stories like that, people who got power through committees and then treated it like a badge, but the paper wasn't written like a mistake. It was written like a threat wrapped in legal, sounding fluff so it could pretend to be polite. That afternoon, I checked the county records again, not because I doubted my deed, but because I wanted receipts. I pulled up the parcel map, the legal description, the recorded documents, the easements, the lot lines. Everything said what it had always said. I owned the land. No HOA covenant had been recorded against it. No deed restrictions tied me to anyone's neighborhood authority. The nearest HOA-managed subdivision was a separate development entirely, separated by a strip of older lots and a chunk of wooded land that had been there long before their decorative entrance sign. If someone was trying to claim me, they were doing it without the paperwork to back it up. The next 2 days were quiet, which should have reassured me, but didn't. In my experience, silence after a threat doesn't mean it's over. It means someone is gearing up, rehearsing their outrage, printing another stack of papers. I kept working the land, cleaning brush, marking where I wanted to put a small shed, checking the slope for drainage. The entire time, a tightness sat in the back of my neck like a storm that hadn't arrived yet. Every crunch of tires on the road made me look up. Every distant engine made me pause with a tool in my hand. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I also didn't want to be caught off guard by a problem that believed it had authority. On Friday, the second notice appeared. This one wasn't stapled. This one was taped, and the tape had been wrapped around the gate chain like a ribbon on a bad gift. It was longer, more aggressive, and included an attachment that looked like a scanned signature block. It declared I had been properly notified, and that failure to comply would result in immediate enforcement. It mentioned authorized agents and removal contractors, as if the HOA had a team of people ready to show up and physically move me off land I legally owned. The most ridiculous part was the tone. It assumed compliance was inevitable. It wasn't asking. It wasn't even threatening like a person. It was threatening like a system, the kind of system that depends on people being too intimidated or too tired to fight back. I didn't call anyone in the HOA because the letter didn't list a real office number, just a generic email and a P.O. box. I didn't reply to the email because I wasn't interested in being pulled into a debate with someone who believed they could argue reality into changing. Instead, I started doing what people do when they feel the ground shifting under them. I documented everything. I photographed both notices on the gate. I photographed the staples, the tape, the chain. I saved the papers in a folder like they were evidence because they were. I wrote down dates and times because dates and times turn a story into a case. I even walked the perimeter and photographed the old survey markers, the corners, the places where my land ended and someone else's began. If someone was about to push, I wanted to be ready. That weekend, I drove to the edge of the nearby subdivision, the one I suspected this nonsense was coming from. It had the usual HOA vibe, a stone monument sign, a landscaped median, a sense of curated perfection that always looks expensive until you notice the cheap mulch. I didn't stop inside. I didn't want to be accused of trespassing while someone else was claiming my land. But I did read the name of the community off the sign, then searched it on my phone. The HOA existed. It had a website that looked like it had been updated by someone who loved power, point fonts. It bragged about protecting property values and maintaining standards. It posted meeting minutes that were mostly about lawn heights, mailbox paint colors, and community integrity. It had a board roster, and one name popped up repeatedly in the minutes, the kind of name you start seeing everywhere once you're looking. The president, the one who filed motions, the one who led enforcement initiatives. I didn't need a face to imagine the personality. I'd seen the archetype before. Someone who treated rules like weapons, who spoke in bylaws, the way other people speak in common sense. Someone who believed their neighborhood didn't stop at the decorative sign, but extended as far as their confidence could reach. On Monday morning, the first real escalation happened. I pulled up to my gate and saw tire marks in the dirt beside the drive, fresh and careless, as if someone had parked too close and spun out. The chain on the gate had been handled, the padlock wasn't broken, but it had new scratches like metal had scraped against it. And hanging from the chain was a third notice, now laminated, because apparently paper threats weren't durable enough. This one announced that authorized security personnel would be dispatched to ensure compliance. It claimed I was trespassing on community, managed property, and that removal would be coordinated if I remained. It was so bold it almost made me laugh, except it didn't feel funny standing alone on my own land reading a laminated lie. That was the moment the situation stopped being an annoying misunderstanding and became something darker. Because a letter is just ink until someone tries to enforce it with bodies. A laminated notice promising security wasn't a complaint. It was a plan. I did what any reasonable person would do when someone threatens to use force through security personnel. On private property, I called the non-emergency line and asked what I should do if private security showed up and tried to remove me. I explained that I was the deeded owner, that I had paperwork, that an HOA was trying to claim jurisdiction. I wasn't asking the police to act preemptively. I was asking how to protect myself from an illegal situation. The dispatcher told me in careful terms that private security had no authority to evict anyone from property without a court order, and that if someone attempted to forcibly remove me, I should call 911. It wasn't a solution, but it was a line in the sand. The law didn't recognize laminated threats. That night, I barely slept. Not because I feared a fair fight, but because unfair fights are unpredictable. When people believe they're righteous, they do reckless things. They bring friends, they bring uniforms, they bring cameras to perform the version of the story they want the world to believe. I lay there imagining a truck rolling up, men stepping out with tactical vests, some clipboard, wielding HOA enforcer behind them pointing at my trailer like it was contraband. I imagined them trying to intimidate me into leaving, counting on my frustration to make me walk away just to avoid the hassle, and the more I imagined it, the more I realized that was the whole strategy. By Tuesday morning, the air felt different, the way it does before a confrontation, even if nothing has happened yet. I drove out to the property early, before work, just to check. The gate was still locked, but the gravel beyond it looked disturbed in places, like someone had walked around near the entrance. I parked, listened, and heard nothing but wind and distant traffic. Then, far down the road, I heard an engine slow. The sound grew louder, then stopped. Doors opened. Footsteps hit gravel, and from the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the tree line where the road met the edge of my fence. Whatever was coming next wasn't another notice. It was people, and they weren't here to be corrected gently. The HOA had decided to turn their paperwork fantasy into a physical show of force, and they were about to find out what happens when you step onto the wrong side of a deed with the wrong kind of confidence. The first thing that struck me wasn't fear, it was disbelief, the kind that settles in when reality suddenly feels scripted by someone who doesn't understand how laws actually work. Two black SUVs rolled fully into view from the road, heavy tires grinding my gravel like they owned it. They parked just outside the gate at first, angled aggressively, blocking the entrance as if that alone could rewrite property lines. The doors opened in sequence, deliberate and practiced, and 4 men stepped out wearing matching tactical-style uniforms. They weren't police, not even close, but the outfits were clearly designed to make people think twice before questioning them. Black cargo pants, utility belts, vests with patches that said security, and sunglasses that hid their eyes even though the sun was barely up. They moved with the confidence of people who expected compliance, the kind of confidence that only works when nobody challenges it. Behind them came a 5th figure, stepping out of the 2nd SUV more slowly, dressed not in tactical gear, but in business, casual clothes that looked carefully chosen to appear official without being official. Khakis, collared shirt, clipboard tucked under one arm. He surveyed the land like it offended him personally, like my trailer and my trees were an insult to his sense of order. He didn't need to introduce himself for me to know exactly who he was meant to represent. This was the HOA emissary, the human face of a committee decision that had grown teeth. I stayed by my truck, phone already in my hand, camera rolling, not because I wanted a viral moment, but because documentation is the only language people like this understand once things go sideways. The men approached the gate, one of them rattling the chain lightly, testing it, like he expected it to give way under assumption alone. Another scanned the area, eyes flicking from the trailer to the trees, probably assessing how difficult it would be to make me uncomfortable enough to leave. They didn't greet me, they didn't ask questions, their posture said this was already decided. The man with the clipboard began reading from it, not to me specifically, but to the air, projecting his voice like an announcement. He referenced violations, unauthorized occupancy, and immediate enforcement actions. He spoke as though he were narrating an eviction that had already been approved by some invisible authority. There was no mention of a court order, no mention of a sheriff, no mention of anything real, just HOA language inflated to sound like law. The security guards shifted subtly as he spoke, spreading out a little, forming a loose semicircle that was clearly meant to feel intimidating. I didn't respond verbally. I didn't need to. I held up my phone so it was clear I was recording, then calmly stepped closer to the gate, staying on my side of it. One of the guards raised a hand, palm out, signaling me to stop, as if that gesture carried weight. It didn't, I informed them, clearly and slowly, that this was my property, that I was the deeded owner, and that they were trespassing. The word trespassing landed differently than the rest. I could see it in the slight shift of posture from one of the guards, the smallest hesitation, like a crack in the armor. The clipboard man doubled down immediately. He asserted that the property fell under HOA jurisdiction, that I had been notified, and that security had been authorized to ensure compliance. He said authorized several times, as if repetition could substitute for legitimacy. He gestured toward the guards and implied they would remove me if necessary. That was the moment the situation crossed from intimidation into something far more serious, because threatening removal without lawful authority isn't enforcement, it's coercion. I told them again that without a court order and a sheriff present, they had no authority to evict anyone from private property. I informed them that I had already spoken to law enforcement and that any attempt to forcibly remove me would result in an immediate 911 call. One of the guards looked toward the clipboard man, clearly uncomfortable now, while another scoffed quietly, like he'd heard this resistance before and assumed it would crumble. The clipboard man tried a different tactic. He spoke about fines, liens, and escalating consequences, about how cooperation now would be easier than fighting the system later. It was the language of pressure, of trying to make me feel small and outnumbered, like resistance was futile because bureaucracy would eventually crush me. What he didn't understand was that bureaucracy only works when it's grounded in actual authority. Without that, it's just noise. I reached into my truck and pulled out a folder, thick with printed documents. I didn't hand them over, I didn't need to. I simply opened it enough for the top pages to be visible. My deed, the parcel map, the county seal. I pointed out, slowly, that there were no HOA covenants recorded against my property, that their subdivision was separate, and that any claim otherwise was false. I told them they were welcome to leave and consult their legal counsel, but they were not welcome to remain on my land. That's when the clipboard man's expression shifted from confidence to irritation. His voice hardened. He accused me of being difficult, of trying to exploit loopholes, of undermining community standards. He spoke like someone personally offended that the world wasn't bending for him. He took a step closer to the gate, leaning in slightly, lowering his voice as if that would make it more serious. He said security would remain on site until I vacated. I didn't argue anymore. I took my phone, clearly showed the screen recording, and dialed 911. I stated my location, identified myself as the property owner, and reported that private security hired by an HOA was attempting an illegal eviction and refusing to leave my property. I kept my voice calm and factual. No emotion, just facts. The change was immediate. The guard stiffened. One of them muttered something under his breath that sounded like not worth it. The clipboard man's face flushed, and he began insisting that there was no need to involve police, that this could be handled civilly. That word, civilly, coming from someone threatening removal, would have been funny if it wasn't so revealing. While waiting for deputies, the group lingered awkwardly near the gate. The guards stopped spreading out and instead clustered closer together, their earlier bravado evaporating now that real authority had been invited. The clipboard man busied himself with his papers, pretending confidence, but his hands betrayed him, flipping pages that didn't need flipping. When the sheriff's cruiser finally appeared at the end of the road, lights not flashing but presence unmistakable, the entire dynamic shifted. The guards straightened like schoolkids caught out of bounds. The clipboard man exhaled sharply, then plastered on a professional smile that looked more like a grimace. The deputy stepped out slowly, surveyed the scene, and asked a simple question that cut through all the theatrics. Who owned the property? I raised my hand and said my name. The clipboard man opened his mouth to object. The deputy held up a hand, not even looking at him yet, and asked to see my identification and proof of ownership. I handed over the folder. He reviewed it carefully, nodding slightly as he read. Then he turned to the HOA representative and asked for their documentation. What followed was a silence so heavy it felt like gravity. The clipboard man fumbled, produced copies of HOA bylaws, enforcement notices, and a map that looked suspiciously unofficial. The deputy glanced at them briefly, then asked the question that would unravel everything. Where was the recorded covenant tying this parcel to the HOA? No one answered. The deputy's expression hardened, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't going to end with them simply leaving embarrassed. Because false claims of authority, forged documents, and attempted illegal eviction aren't HOA issues. They're criminal ones. As the deputy reached for his radio, the clipboard man's entire posture collapsed, and I realized the HOA hadn't just overstepped. They had walked straight into something they couldn't HOA their way out of. The deputy didn't raise his voice, didn't puff out his chest, didn't do anything dramatic, which somehow made the moment far more severe. He simply stood there, holding two very different sets of documents, one grounded in county records and the other floating on assumption, and let the silence do the work. The clipboard man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, suddenly very aware that the performance he'd rehearsed didn't include this part. The security guards, who had arrived with posture and presence, now looked like they were reconsidering every decision that led them here, their hands resting awkwardly near belts that no longer felt empowering. The deputy asked again, calmly, where the recorded covenant was, the one that legally bound my parcel to their HOA. He didn't ask it like a challenge. He asked it like a formality, the kind that expects an answer because the law requires one. The clipboard man attempted to fill the silence with explanations instead of evidence. He spoke about historical understandings, about how the land was always intended to be part of the community, about how previous owners had informally complied. Each word dug the hole deeper. The deputy listened, expression neutral, then responded in the way that only someone who actually enforces law can. He explained that intentions, understandings, and informal arrangements don't mean anything without recorded instruments. He stated plainly that unless there was a covenant filed with the county tying my deed to their HOA, they had no jurisdiction, no enforcement authority, no right to be on the property. That should have been the end of it. A reasonable person would have accepted the correction, apologized, and left. But the clipboard man wasn't operating on reason anymore. He was operating on sunk cost and wounded pride. He insisted the HOA attorney had reviewed everything. He claimed there were supplemental documents. He implied the county records were incomplete. Each excuse sounded weaker than the last, and the deputy's patience thinned in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. The deputy then asked a question that changed the temperature entirely. He asked whether the HOA had authorized these security personnel to remove me from the property. The clipboard man hesitated, just long enough to be telling, then said yes, that enforcement actions had been approved. The deputy nodded once and asked the guards directly whether they had been instructed to physically remove the property owner if he refused to leave. One guard avoided eye contact. Another looked straight ahead and said they were here to ensure compliance. The deputy clarified, slowly, whether that meant removal. After another pause, one of them said yes. That single word reframed the entire situation. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was an attempted illegal eviction. The deputy informed them clearly that private security has no authority to evict anyone, that eviction requires a court order, and that attempting to remove a lawful property owner could constitute criminal charges, including trespassing and coercion. He informed the clipboard man that misrepresenting authority and presenting unrecorded or falsified documents to justify enforcement could escalate matters significantly. The clipboard man's face drained of color. The confidence that had carried him through laminated notices and staged intimidation evaporated under the weight of actual consequences. He began backtracking immediately, claiming there had been a miscommunication, that no one intended to physically remove me, that security was merely present as a deterrent. The deputy didn't argue. He simply asked why security was needed at all if the HOA had no jurisdiction. The clipboard man had no answer. While this was happening, the deputy radioed in, calmly reporting the situation and requesting confirmation from dispatch regarding the parcel's status. The response came back quickly, affirming what we already knew. The property was privately owned, not subject to any HOA, with no recorded covenants or liens. Hearing it over the radio made it official in a way the clipboard man couldn't spin. The guards exchanged glances. One of them subtly stepped back, increasing the distance between himself and the gate, as if proximity alone might implicate him further. The deputy then issued a clear directive. He ordered the security personnel and the HOA representative to leave the property immediately. He warned them that any further attempts to contact or intimidate me on the land would be documented and could result in charges. He told them that any disputes regarding property boundaries or authority should be handled through proper legal channels, not intimidation tactics. There was no room for negotiation in his tone. As they gathered themselves to leave, the clipboard man made one last attempt to save face, muttering about how this wasn't over, how the HOA would pursue this properly. The deputy turned to him and informed him that pursuing false claims through the legal system could expose the HOA to liability, and that he strongly recommended consulting an attorney before taking any further action. The words weren't threatening, but they carried weight because they were true. The SUV backed away from the gate, tires crunching over gravel that suddenly felt hostile to them. The guards avoided looking in my direction. Clipboard man kept his eyes forward, jaw tight, as if refusing to acknowledge the collapse of his authority. When they finally turned onto the road and disappeared, the quiet returned in a way that felt earned. The deputy stayed for a few minutes longer, asking if there had been any prior incidents, taking note of the notices, photographing the laminated threat. He advised me to keep everything, to continue documenting, and to call immediately if they returned. He explained that while HOA disputes are usually civil, this one had crossed into dangerous territory because of the attempted use of force. Before leaving, he looked around the land, at the trailer, the trees, the open space, and said something that stuck with me. He said people get bold when they think paperwork makes them powerful, but paperwork without law is just paper. After he left, I stood there alone again, but the solitude felt different. It wasn't anxious anymore. It was resolved. The HOA plan had failed in the open, exposed for what it was, but I also knew something important. People like that don't always stop when they're corrected. Sometimes, being told no just makes them look for quieter, dirtier ways to win. As I locked the gate and walked back toward the trailer, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, just the end of the first act. Somewhere behind those decorative subdivision signs, a board was about to panic, and panic has a way of turning bad ideas into worse ones. The days after the sheriff cleared them off my property were quiet in the way that follows a near miss, calm on the surface but buzzing underneath with unresolved tension. I kept working the land, but now every sound carried a sharper edge of awareness. I wasn't afraid they would come back openly, not after a deputy had spelled things out in plain language. But I was realistic enough to know that people who rely on intimidation rarely accept embarrassment gracefully. When authority slips through their fingers, they tend to grab for something else, something sneakier. That instinct proved right sooner than I expected. 3 days later, I received a certified letter in my mailbox, the kind that announces itself with official seriousness before you even open it. The return address was a law firm, not the HOA directly, and that alone was meant to intimidate. Legal letterhead is just another uniform, another costume designed to make people comply without questioning the substance underneath. I opened it slowly, already braced for what it would contain. The letter claimed the firm represented the HOA and asserted that my property was subject to previously recorded restrictions that had been overlooked in initial county searches. It accused me of refusing lawful enforcement and warned of impending legal action if I did not vacate the land or bring it into compliance. What stood out immediately wasn't the threat, but the attachment. Included was a copy of what appeared to be a covenant document, complete with a notary stamp and a recording reference number. At first glance, it looked legitimate, the kind of thing that could make someone panic if they didn't know better. The problem for them was that I did know better. I had already pulled the county records myself. I had already confirmed there was no such document tied to my parcel, and now here they were, suddenly producing one after the sheriff had called them out. That timing alone raised alarms. I examined the document closely, line by line, and the more I read, the worse it got. The legal description didn't quite match my property. It referenced boundary markers that didn't exist. The recording number form didn't align with the county's system. Even the notary stamp looked off, like it had been copied from a template rather than applied by a real person on a real date. This wasn't just an overreach anymore. This looked like fabrication. Instead of responding to the law firm, I went straight to the county recorder's office in person. There are things you can do online, and then there are things you verify face-to-face when the stakes are high. I brought the letter, the attached covenant, my deed, and my parcel map. The clerk took one look at the supposed recording number and frowned. She typed it into the system, then tried a different variation. Nothing came up. She checked the Grandorgan, T-index, still nothing. When I showed her the notary stamp, she called over a supervisor. What followed was a quiet, professional confirmation of what I already suspected. The document had never been recorded with the county. The notary commission number didn't match any active or expired notary in their system. The formatting didn't match county standards from any era. In short, the covenant was fake, not ambiguous, not disputed, fake. The supervisor asked how I had obtained it. I explained the situation from the beginning, the notices, the private security, the sheriff's involvement, and now this letter. As I spoke, her expression shifted from neutral to concerned. She told me to make copies of everything and suggested I speak with the sheriff's office again, this time not as a potential victim of intimidation, but as someone who may have been targeted with fraudulent documents. When I left the building, the gravity of it all settled in. HOA drama usually lives in the gray space of petty enforcement and civil disputes. This had crossed into something far more serious. Forged legal documents aren't a mistake. They're a crime, and the fact that a law firm's letterhead was attached, whether knowingly or not, meant this mess had spread beyond the HOA board's original power trip. I contacted the sheriff's office and asked to speak with the same deputy if possible. He remembered the incident immediately. I emailed him scanned copies of the letter and the fake covenant, then followed up with a phone call explaining what the county had confirmed. The tone of the conversation changed quickly. What had been an enforcement warning now became an investigation. He told me to preserve all originals and not to engage further with the HOA or their representatives. He said a detective would likely want to speak with me. That evening, I received another email, this time directly from the HOA president. The tone was noticeably different from the earlier notices. Gone was the bold authority, replaced with a strained formality that tried to sound conciliatory without actually apologizing. The email suggested there had been confusion regarding property boundaries and documentation, and proposed a meeting to resolve matters amicably. It didn't mention the sheriff. It didn't mention security. It certainly didn't mention the fake covenant. It read like a retreat disguised as diplomacy. I didn't respond. There was no meeting that could resolve forged documents and attempted illegal eviction. That was no longer a neighborly issue. That was a matter for law enforcement and attorneys, not folding chairs and community centers. The next morning, a detective from the sheriff's department arrived at my property. He took photographs, collected copies of every notice, letter, and document, and asked detailed questions about timelines, names, and interactions. He wasn't theatrical or confrontational. He was methodical, the kind of person who builds cases brick by brick. When I showed him the laminated notice threatening security enforcement, he shook his head slightly. When I showed him the fake covenant, his jaw tightened. He explained that presenting forged documents to assert authority could constitute multiple charges, including fraud and impersonation of legal authority. He also explained that if the HOA knowingly hired private security to perform an illegal eviction, that could expose both the board members and the security company to liability. The words were calm, but the implications were heavy. By the time he left, I understood something the HOA clearly didn't. They thought this was about control, about forcing compliance through pressure. They thought worst case scenario was a civil dispute they could outspend or outlast. What they didn't realize was that once you introduce fake documents and armed intimidation into the equation, you stop playing HOA games and start answering to the state. As the sun dipped behind the trees that evening, my phone buzzed with another notification. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from the security company, a short message stating they would no longer be involved and requesting confirmation that no further services were needed. It was the quiet sound of people backing away from a fire they suddenly realized could burn them too. I stood there on my land, looking out over the property lines no committee could redraw, knowing that somewhere an HOA board was scrambling. And when organizations scramble, mistakes surface. Documents get exposed. Emails get forwarded, and the truth, once it starts coming out, rarely stops at the first crack. Once the detective stepped in, the entire tone of the situation shifted from external pressure to internal collapse. I didn't hear anything directly from the HOA for a couple of days, and that silence told me more than any threatening letter ever could. Organizations built on control don't go quiet unless they're panicking. They hold emergency meetings, they send frantic emails, they start pointing fingers, and before long, those cracks begin to show on the outside. The first sign came from an unexpected place. A neighbor from the subdivision, someone whose property backed up to the far edge of mine, stopped by the fence one afternoon. He didn't cross it. He didn't come in with accusations or authority. He stood on his side, hands in his pockets, posture hesitant, and spoke with the kind of discomfort that only comes when someone realizes they've been represented badly. He explained that word was spreading in the neighborhood that the HOA had messed up badly, that there were questions about forged paperwork and an investigation. He said the board had told residents there was a boundary dispute, but that story wasn't holding up anymore. He didn't apologize directly, but he didn't defend them either. He just wanted to make it clear that not everyone in the subdivision thought what had happened was acceptable. That mattered more than he probably realized. HOA love to pretend they speak for everyone, but they only function because most people don't pay close attention until something breaks. When residents start paying attention, power shifts. Later that day, I received an email that wasn't addressed to me, but included me anyway. It was an internal HOA message, forwarded accidentally or intentionally by someone who had finally decided they didn't want to be complicit. The subject line referenced enforcement exposure, and the contents were chaos. Board members arguing over who authorized the security company, questions about who provided the covenant document, panicked speculation about criminal liability. One message tried to minimize everything as a misunderstanding. Another demanded to know why the president had pushed so aggressively without verified records. Names were named, dates were cited. It was the kind of digital paper trail people regret creating when emotions override judgment. What stood out most was how quickly loyalty evaporated. The same board that had confidently threatened eviction days earlier was now scrambling to distance itself from the decisions that led them here. Responsibility was being treated like a hot coal, passed from one inbox to another. One member suggested hiring a separate attorney for personal protection. Another asked whether emails could be deleted. That single question said everything. The detective called me the next morning to ask if I had received any communications from HOA members or residents since his visit. I told him about the neighbor and the email. He asked me to forward the message in full, including headers. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded like someone watching a predictable pattern unfold. By midweek, the HOA president resigned. The announcement was brief and framed as a personal decision, citing stress and a desire to focus on family. It didn't mention forged documents, illegal enforcement, or sheriff involvement. But resignations don't happen in a vacuum, especially not under investigation. The timing spoke louder than the words. The board appointed an interim president almost immediately, someone described in the minutes as more level-headed. That phrase alone suggested an admission that the previous leadership had not been. A letter was sent to all residents assuring them that the HOA was cooperating fully with authorities and conducting an internal review. I received a copy as well, despite not being a member, which felt less like courtesy and more like damage control. The security company's withdrawal became official shortly after. Their website quietly removed any mention of HOA enforcement services. A notice circulated within the subdivision that future security contracts would be reevaluated. Translation: no one wanted their name attached to this anymore. Then came the call from the detective that confirmed what the HOA had been trying to outrun. He told me that the fake covenant document had been traced back to a draft file on a board member's personal computer. It hadn't been recorded, but it had been formatted to look official enough to scare someone into compliance. The notary stamp was digitally copied from an unrelated document. It was sloppy, but it was intentional. He didn't say the word yet, but the implication was clear. Charges were on the table. The HOA attorney withdrew representation the following day. Law firms don't walk away from paying clients lightly. When they do, it's because the risk outweighs the retainer. A new letter arrived shortly after, this time from a different firm, carefully worded, apologetic without admitting fault, requesting that I preserve evidence and refrain from public statements while the matter was resolved. It was the legal equivalent of asking me not to shake the table while everything on it was already sliding off. I kept quiet, just like the detective advised. I didn't post. I didn't respond. I didn't escalate. I let the truth do what it always does when given space. By the end of the week, the subdivision's online forum was buzzing. Residents were questioning dues, governance, and how close they had come to being associated with criminal behavior. Some were angry, some were embarrassed, some were worried about property values, ironically the very thing the HOA claimed to protect. When people realize the authority they trusted was reckless, they don't just get mad. They get cautious. Standing on my land that evening, watching the light fade across property no one could bully me off of anymore, I understood something fundamental about power. It doesn't come from laminated notices, security uniforms, or fake documents. It comes from legitimacy, and once legitimacy is gone, everything built on it starts to crumble fast. The HOA had tried to erase me from my own land. Instead, they had exposed themselves. And the fallout was just beginning. By the time the sheriff's office returned to the subdivision, the HOA confidence had already evaporated. The patrol cars didn't arrive with sirens or spectacle, but their presence alone was enough to ripple through the neighborhood like a warning bell. People noticed. Curtains shifted. Garage doors paused halfway down. This wasn't routine. This was accountability arriving quietly, the way it always does when it's already too late to manage appearances. I wasn't there when the deputies first pulled into the HOA common area, but I heard about it within hours. The detective had called me beforehand, not to ask permission, but to inform me that interviews and evidence collection were underway. He didn't need anything from me at that moment. That alone spoke volumes. For the first time since this started, I wasn't the focus. The HOA was. From what I later learned, the sheriff's office requested access to HOA records, including enforcement logs, meeting minutes, email communications, and contracts with the security company. The interim board cooperated publicly, handing over what they claimed was everything. Privately, however, the process was less smooth. Some records were missing, others had been altered. Timestamps didn't line up. Emails referenced attachments that no longer existed. Each inconsistency raised more questions than it answered. The detective told me that once you start seeing gaps in documentation, investigators stop assuming incompetence and start considering intent. HOA are meticulous when it comes to fines and violations. They don't suddenly lose records unless someone made a decision to make them disappear. That decision, in itself, becomes part of the case. Meanwhile, the former HOA president wasn't answering calls. His resignation hadn't bought him distance, only scrutiny. Deputies eventually located him at his residence, not to arrest him yet, but to formally request an interview. He declined without an attorney present, which was his right, but also an unspoken admission that this was no longer something he could talk his way out of. The board member whose computer had been identified as the source of the fake covenant was less composed. According to the detective, that interview ended early when contradictions piled up faster than explanations. While all of this was unfolding, I received something I hadn't expected, a formal letter from the sheriff's department confirming that I was not under investigation and that I had been identified as a victim of attempted unlawful eviction and document fraud. It was a simple letter, but it carried enormous weight. It meant the narrative was no longer up for debate. I wasn't the problem homeowner resisting rules. I was the landowner targeted by overreach. The HOA, on the other hand, was rapidly losing whatever benefit of the doubt it once had. Residents were called in as witnesses. Some had been present at meetings where enforcement against my property was discussed. Others had received emails celebrating progress in removing non-compliant land use. Those messages, written casually and confidently at the time, now read like confessions. The security company was also contacted again, this time formally. Their initial eagerness to distance themselves didn't absolve them of responsibility. They were asked to provide contracts, instructions, and communications with the HOA. The guards who had stood at my gate were interviewed separately. One of them, according to the detective, was visibly shaken. He admitted they were told the HOA had full authority and that the property owner was refusing to comply with lawful eviction. He said he had questioned the lack of a sheriff, but was reassured it was handled. That reassurance, it turned out, came from the HOA president himself. That detail mattered a lot. As the investigation widened, the interim board's attempts at damage control grew more frantic. They issued another letter to residents emphasizing cooperation and transparency. They hired a compliance consultant. They scheduled a special meeting to restore trust. But trust doesn't return just because you announce it on letterhead. Once residents realized their dues had been used to fund forged documents and private intimidation, the mood shifted from passive acceptance to active anger. I was invited, indirectly, to attend the special meeting, not as a participant, but as an observer. I declined. I didn't need to sit in a folding chair and watch people argue over how badly they'd miscalculated. My involvement was no longer necessary. The process had moved beyond personal vindication into institutional reckoning. A few days later, the detective visited my property again, this time to inform me of a key development. He explained that the district attorney's office had been briefed and that potential charges were being evaluated, including fraud, conspiracy, and impersonation of legal authority. He didn't promise outcomes. He didn't speculate. He simply stated that the case had substance and momentum. Before he left, he told me something that stuck with me. He said most HOA abuses never escalate this far because people give in early. They leave, they pay, they comply just to make the problem go away. This case went differently because I didn't. Not because I was aggressive, but because I insisted on legality. That insistence forced the truth into the open. As his vehicle disappeared down the gravel road, I realized the irony of it all. The HOA had sent security to intimidate me into leaving quietly. Instead, they had invited scrutiny that would follow them long after my name was removed from their agenda. And the most telling part was this: the sheriff hadn't come back to my land to enforce anything. He came back to their neighborhood to clean something up. What started as an attempt to erase a landowner had become a cautionary tale, and it was no longer being written by an HOA board, but by the justice system. Up until that point, everything had unfolded quietly, confined to emails, interviews, and the careful, methodical pace of an investigation. But stories like this rarely stay contained forever. Too many people had seen too much, and once the weight of potential criminal charges settled in, silence stopped serving anyone except those who caused the damage. The shift from private reckoning to public exposure happened the way it always does now, not through an official announcement, but through a leak. It started with a post in the subdivision's online community forum. Someone shared a vague warning about an ongoing investigation involving HOA leadership and urged residents to stay informed. Within hours, screenshots of old enforcement emails began circulating. Someone else posted redacted copies of the sheriff's confirmation letter that had been sent to residents who were interviewed. Speculation filled the gaps faster than facts could. Names were guessed. Timelines were debated, and then, inevitably, someone connected the dots to me. By the next morning, a local reporter reached out. Not a national outlet, not even a major city paper, but a regional news site that specialized in consumer issues and local government overreach. The email was cautious, respectful, and specific, which told me this wasn't clickbait phishing. They already had documents. They already had sources inside the HOA. They just wanted confirmation and context. I didn't respond immediately. I contacted the detective first, asking whether speaking to the press would interfere with the investigation. He didn't tell me what to do, but he made it clear that the facts were already circulating and that anything I shared should be truthful and documented. He also reminded me that public scrutiny can accelerate accountability, but it can also provoke defensiveness. The decision, he said, was mine. I agreed to provide a written statement and documents, nothing more. No interviews, no camera, just a factual account of what happened, supported by evidence. The reporter accepted. By that afternoon, the article was live. The headline was restrained but devastating. It described an HOA accused of using forged documents and private security to intimidate a landowner, now under sheriff investigation. It didn't sensationalize. It didn't exaggerate. It simply laid out the timeline. The notices, the security, the sheriff's intervention, the fake covenant, the resignations. It quoted public records and anonymous residents. It didn't need drama. The facts were enough. Once published, the story spread fast. Other local outlets picked it up. Social media did what it always does, boiling complex situations down to moral clarity. The HOA went from an internal problem to a public example overnight. Comments poured in from people who had experienced similar overreach elsewhere. Patterns emerged. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger issue of private organizations pretending to wield public authority. The HOA issued a statement within hours, carefully worded and painfully vague. It emphasized cooperation, denied intentional wrongdoing, and framed everything as a misunderstanding. That statement didn't land the way they hoped. In the context of forged documents and security intimidation, misunderstanding sounded like an insult to the public's intelligence. Residents reacted immediately. Some demanded refunds of dues. Others called for a full board dissolution. A few defended the HOA weakly, but their voices were drowned out by the sheer volume of concern. When trust collapses publicly, it doesn't do so politely. I felt the impact in smaller, more personal ways. People I didn't know began reaching out, thanking me for standing firm, sharing their own stories of being bullied by HOA, asking for advice. I didn't respond to most of them. I wasn't trying to become a symbol. I just wanted my land and my peace. But it was impossible to ignore the realization that by refusing to be intimidated, I had inadvertently opened a door others had been afraid to push on. The sheriff's office felt the pressure too. The detective told me the DA office was now moving faster, not because of media influence, but because public awareness had highlighted the importance of setting a precedent. When private groups cross into criminal behavior, ignoring it sends the wrong message. Behind the scenes, the HOA unraveled further. Board members resigned in clusters. The interim president stepped down less than a week after the article ran. Emergency meetings turned into shouting matches. Legal fees ballooned. The insurance carrier reportedly began reviewing coverage, which is a polite way of saying they were looking for reasons not to pay. The security company released a public statement distancing itself from the incident, emphasizing that it acted on information provided by the HOA and that it had updated its vetting procedures. It was corporate self-preservation, not accountability, but it underscored the central truth. Everyone involved was now scrambling to avoid being the one left holding the liability. As for me, I stayed on my land, working as usual, letting the noise happen at a distance. The trailer was still there, the trees were still there, the gate was still locked. The difference now was that no one could pretend I didn't belong. Late one evening, as the sun dipped low and the air cooled, I checked my phone and saw something that made me pause. A notification from the county clerk's office confirming that a new filing had been made related to my parcel. It wasn't a lien. It wasn't a restriction. It was a formal notice attached to the property record documenting an attempted fraudulent claim of encumbrance. A red flag, permanently recorded, that meant anyone who looked up the land in the future would see what happened here. The HOA attempt to claim authority over my property would follow them in public record. They had tried to erase me quietly. Instead, they had written themselves into the record, and now there was no going back to anonymity. By the time the district attorney's office made its move, the HOA had already lost control of its own narrative. Resignations had thinned the board to a skeleton crew. Committees had dissolved. Residents were more concerned with protecting themselves than enforcing anyone else's compliance. But despite all of that, there was still a lingering belief among some involved that this would end quietly, that white-collar messes rarely turn into real consequences. That belief didn't survive the first set of charges. The detective called me early in the morning, his tone measured but firm. He informed me that the district attorney had approved criminal charges against 2 individuals connected to the HOA. One was the former HOA president. The other was the board member whose computer had been identified as the source of the forged covenant document. The charges included felony fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and impersonation of legal authority. There were also misdemeanor charges related to criminal trespass and coercion, tied to the use of private security. What struck me most wasn't the severity of the charges, but the clarity. There was no hedging language. No allegedly. In the explanation he gave me, the evidence, he said, was strong. Emails, drafts, witness statements, and the security company's own records lined up in a way that told a coherent story. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan that got exposed. The arrests didn't happen in dramatic fashion. There were no early morning raids or handcuffs in front of news cameras. Both individuals were summoned, booked, and released pending court dates. Even so, the impact was immediate and unmistakable. News outlets updated their coverage. Headlines shifted from under investigation to charged. The language hardened. So did public opinion. The HOA released another statement, shorter this time, acknowledging the charges and reiterating that the individuals were no longer associated with the organization. It was the corporate equivalent of cutting loose ballast to stay afloat. But the problem was that the ballast had been the structure itself. Without leadership, without credibility, the HOA was barely functioning. Residents began openly questioning whether the HOA should continue to exist at all. Meetings were sparsely attended. Dues payments slowed. Some homeowners consulted attorneys about withdrawal or dissolution. Others worried about how association instability might affect property values. The irony was thick. The very tools meant to protect value had become liabilities. I received official notice from the district attorney's office that I had been listed as a key witness. The letter outlined my rights, the process, and what to expect if the case went to trial. It also included victim impact resources, a detail that underscored how seriously the state was treating the situation. I hadn't been physically harmed, but the law recognized that attempted unlawful eviction and fraud carry real consequences. At the same time, a civil case quietly took shape. Several residents filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA for misuse of funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and exposing members to legal risk. I wasn't involved in that case, but it ran parallel to the criminal one, further tightening the vise. Insurance coverage was officially denied, legal fees became a communal burden, the board, what remained of it, faced impossible choices. The security company settled quickly. They reached out through counsel, offering a written apology and a confidential settlement to avoid further exposure. I accepted, not because I needed the money, but because it closed one chapter cleanly. Their role had been reckless, but they weren't the architects. The law understood the difference. As court dates approached, I prepared myself for the possibility of testifying. I reviewed documents, refreshed timelines, and reminded myself that facts don't change just because they're repeated in a courtroom. Still, there was a weight to it. Standing up for your rights is one thing. Becoming part of a criminal case is another. What surprised me most during that time was how quiet my land felt again. No notices, no emails, no surprise visits. The gate stayed closed. The road stayed empty. The trees didn't know there were court filings attached to their shade. Life returned to a rhythm that had nothing to do with HOA or headlines, and yet, the consequences kept unfolding beyond my fence line. The former HOA president's name, once associated with community leadership, now appeared in public arrest records. The board member who had drafted the fake covenant resigned from his job outside the HOA after his employer learned of the charges. Reputations don't recover easily from fraud. The DA office made it clear they intended to pursue the case fully. This wasn't about punishing arrogance. It was about drawing a boundary. Private organizations don't get to invent authority, forge documents, and threaten people with force. Not without consequences. As I stood one evening watching the sun settle over land that had nearly been stolen through paperwork and pressure, I realized something profound. The HOA had expected me to fold, to leave quietly, to disappear. Instead, their actions had anchored my place more firmly than ever, and the next chapter wouldn't be written in meeting minutes or emails. It would be written in a courtroom under oath, where laminated lies don't survive first contact with the truth. Chapter 9, the courtroom where power meant nothing. The courthouse didn't look like a place where personal vendettas go to die. It was plain, institutional, built for function rather than symbolism. And yet, for everyone involved in this case, it represented the end of illusion. There were no HOA titles inside those walls. No presidents, no committees, no enforcement powers. Just defendants, witnesses, attorneys, and a judge who didn't care about neighborhood standards or decorative entrance signs. When the case was called, the former HOA president sat at the defense table, looking smaller than I remembered. Without authority, without a board backing him, he was just another man in a suit facing the consequences of his choices. The board member charged alongside him avoided eye contact with everyone, his posture closed, his confidence long gone. The courtroom wasn't hostile. It didn't need to be. The weight of evidence carried its own gravity. The prosecution laid out the timeline methodically, the notices, the decision to hire private security, the instructions given to that security company, the creation of a fake covenant designed to intimidate a landowner into compliance. Each piece was presented calmly, supported by emails, drafts, and testimony. The sheriff's deputy described the scene at my gate, the lack of a court order, the attempt to assert authority that didn't exist. The detective explained how the document had been traced, how metadata and file histories don't lie even when people do. When it was my turn to testify, there was no drama. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't editorialize. I simply described what happened in order, from the first notice on my gate to the moment the sheriff told them to leave. I explained what it felt like to stand on my own land, while strangers in tactical gear implied they could remove me. I answered questions clearly and honestly. The defense tried to frame the situation as confusion, as a boundary dispute that escalated unintentionally. But confusion doesn't laminate threats. Confusion doesn't fabricate documents, and confusion doesn't send armed security to intimidate a landowner. The judge listened. He asked questions. He wasn't interested in theatrics. He was interested in authority and where it begins and ends. And in this case, it had ended at the edge of my property. The verdicts came after deliberation that felt both endless and inevitable. Guilty on multiple counts. Fraud, conspiracy, impersonation of legal authority. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no gasp, no applause. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the system had done what it was designed to do when given facts instead of fear. Sentencing didn't happen that day. It would come later. But the convictions alone were enough to send a message that rippled far beyond that room. HOA across the county took notice. Attorneys took notice. Security companies revised their policies. The line between private rulemaking and public authority had been redrawn in bold ink. As I left the courthouse, the air felt lighter, not because I'd won, but because something dangerous had been stopped. This wasn't about revenge. It was about precedent, about making sure the next person who gets a laminated threat knows it can be challenged. Back on my land, the gate creaked open the same way it always had. The gravel crunched under my tires. Nothing looked different, and yet everything was, because now there was a record, a verdict, a reminder that power claimed without law collapses the moment it's tested. The courthouse had a way of stripping everyone down to their essentials. Titles didn't echo there, influence didn't carry. Inside those walls, there was no HOA president, no board member, no enforcement committee. There were only names on a docket and actions laid bare under fluorescent lights. When I walked through the security checkpoint that morning, I wasn't nervous in the way people expect. I wasn't angry either. What I felt was a quiet certainty that whatever happened next would be based on reality, not intimidation or paperwork theater. The courtroom filled slowly. Prosecutors organized their files with practiced efficiency. Defense attorneys whispered urgently to clients who no longer looked like people used to being obeyed. The former HOA president sat rigid, hands folded too tightly, eyes forward but unfocused. The board member beside him stared down at the table as if the wood grain might offer an escape route. This was where confidence finally ran out of places to hide. The judge entered without ceremony. There was no gavel slam for drama, just procedure. The case was called, charges read aloud, and suddenly everything that had once been framed as community standards and enforcement authority was reduced to legal language that didn't flatter anyone. Fraud, conspiracy, impersonation of legal authority, words that don't leave much room for interpretation. The prosecution began where it always should have begun, with facts. They walked the court through the timeline in steady, unbroken order. The first notice on my gate, the escalation, the hiring of private security, the instructions given to those guards, the moment they attempted to assert the right to remove a landowner without a court order. Each event was supported by documents, photographs, and testimony. There was no rush. The strength of the case didn't depend on speed. When the sheriff's deputy testified, his voice never changed. He described arriving at my property, reviewing the documents presented by both sides, and determining that the HOA had no jurisdiction. He explained the significance of a recorded covenant and why its absence mattered. He described the point at which the situation shifted from civil dispute to potential criminal conduct. The courtroom listened closely because law enforcement testimony carries weight when it's grounded in restraint rather than ego. The detective followed, and this was where the illusion truly unraveled. He explained how the supposed covenant document had been examined, how the recording number didn't match county systems, how the notary stamp was traced to a digital copy rather than a legitimate commission. He spoke about metadata, file creation dates, and email trails that linked the draft directly to a board member's personal computer. He explained how intent is proven not by a single action, but by patterns that align too cleanly to dismiss. When it was my turn, I took the stand and told the story without embellishment. I described buying the land, verifying the records, and being confronted by notices that claimed authority that didn't exist. I described the arrival of private security, the posture, the implied threat, and the moment I realized intimidation was the strategy. I described calling 911 not out of fear, but out of necessity. I didn't speculate on motives. I didn't attack character. I simply explained what happened when someone tried to remove me from my own property using uniforms and forged paper. The defense tried to soften the edges. They spoke of misunderstandings, of aggressive enforcement culture, of mistakes made under pressure. They suggested confusion over boundaries, miscommunication with security, an overzealous approach that spiraled unintentionally. But the questions they faced were simple, and they had no good answers. Why fabricate a covenant if confusion was the issue? Why laminate threats? Why authorize security to remain on site until a landowner vacated? Those weren't errors, they were choices. The judge asked questions that cut straight through narrative. He asked about authority, about process, about where private governance ends and public law begins. He asked whether any court order existed. He asked whether any lawful eviction process had been